This is 3000 NFL Mock Draft. It's June 16th, 2016, so technically it's 6/16/16. I'm Kenneth Arthur, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, where myself and Rob Staten of SeahawksDraftBlog.com get together. We talk about the draft, we talk about the Seahawks, we talk about the NFL in general, and we've been on hiatus for a few weeks. It's slow during the NFL news cycle, fast for the soccer cycle, from what I hear, across the pond where Rob lives. So we haven't had a chance to get together, but this week, after, and myself, I've taken over ownership, I guess, or managerialship over at fieldgoals.com, so there's been more on my plate. If you've been waiting for an episode of Real in the Field Goals, that's something that you'll have to continue to wait for. But this is a pseudo episode of Real in the Field Goals in the sense that we are talking about the Seahawks today. We're going to be talking to Brent Taylor, a young man who just graduated from the University of Alabama, saw firsthand Jarran Reed, the new Seahawks defensive lineman, many a time, heavily scouted him. And we're going to talk about Reed. We'll talk about some of the other players coming out of Alabama and SEC this year and next year. But starting right off the top, Rob, the Seahawks just had a 3-day mini camp. We got to see some of these players go out there and, for the first time in a while, get to see them perform against one another, get some updates. Pete Carroll today saying that he expects Jimmy Graham and Thomas Rawls to be ready for the regular season, and even that Jimmy Graham was ahead of Thomas Rawls in the rehab process. Any surprises or anything most notable coming out of the Seahawks 3-day minicamp for you?
Well, obviously the Jimmy Graham news is pretty big because of the serious injury that he had. There were sort of fears when it happened that he may not return at all in 2016. So that's good news. So that's the big surprise. It's not a big surprise regarding Thomas Rawls because when I was sort of like 16 years old, I had a double bone and ligament fracture in my ankle, and just having the break was fine. I could probably do sport again within about 6 weeks. But when I was in my early 20s, I wouldn't say I broke my ankle, but I suffered some really serious ligament damage, and I couldn't play sport again for a year. So I was basically sidelined from playing soccer at the time for a year. And it was very painful. It was tough to walk for the first few months. So it sounds like Thomas Rawls has got a very similar injury to that because he's still not 100%. Obviously, they have a sports science team and pro medical facilities, which are probably helping him recover better than I did. But ligament injuries can be pretty serious. They're not necessarily long term though. So once you've actually recovered, you're usually pretty good, and you can always strap the ankle up and give it some nice support. So I don't think there's any real danger in terms of his career or him missing the season. But it perhaps shows how serious this ligament injury is, that he's still not anywhere near 100%.
And as far as the rookie class goes, we've had a few other things go on, and there's been slightly updates here and there. CJ Prosise apparently having a good day today, and with Thomas Rawls' injury maybe still being somewhat up in the air, especially if he's behind Jimmy Graham. Any news on CJ Prosise or Alex Collins and the like would be welcome news. Anything that you've heard or anything coming across the news cycle in terms of the rookies that's been of interest to you?
I just think everything's really encouraging because the Seahawks have got a lot of depth now. You're looking at the running back position. Yeah, they've lost Marshawn Lynch, but they seem to have sort of 3 or 4 guys that they really like competing at that spot. I think the other encouraging thing is how positive people are talking about the depth at cornerback now again. You're hearing great things about the receivers. Paul Richardson apparently looks really sharp. We're hearing a lot of positive things about Russell Wilson. You keep hearing things from people saying this is the best camp we've had in years, or maybe even the best one that we've had in this current era of Seahawks football. And that's all really positive because the one thing that Pete Carroll generally tends to do is be honest to the fans when he speaks to the media. He doesn't tend to over-exaggerate things. If they're not doing well, or if he's not happy with something, he just won't speak glowingly about it. He'll just say, well, there's a few things we need to work on, there are things we need to get sorted out, and that's when he needs to start worrying. When he comes out and basically says everything's great, we look fantastic, it's worth getting excited about. So the Seahawks are in a good position right now. Hopefully they're going to come into camp very healthy, and with the depth that they've got and with the quality that they've got, there's absolutely no reason at this point right now in June to think that they're going to be anything other than a really strong contender in the NFC.
One of those rookies on the Seahawks is Jarran Reed, and as I said earlier, we've got Brent Taylor on the show today. He's been going to Alabama. He just graduated from the University of Alabama. He loves football and he loves the Tide, and he loves players that played for Alabama, understandably so. And not only does he write for the SB Nation blog about Alabama, but he has also guested here on Field Goals recently, giving us a scouting report. Who is Jarran Reed? Just a few notes from that article. Jarran Reed was an unrated linebacker in the class of 2011 out of North Carolina. He was he could not, as a linebacker, not good enough to go to a Division I school. But then he gets bigger. He gets up to 300 pounds. Too late for him to go to Division I school. He goes to East Mississippi Community College. If not for the fact that he fell one credit short, as Reed became this much bigger defensive lineman and a highly touted recruit, he was going to go to the University of Florida, but could not make it because of the credit. So he has to spend another year. And in that year, he finds out more about Alabama, becomes perhaps the top JUCO transfer in the nation, and then he can go to Alabama. Playing at East Mississippi Community College in a town called Scuba, Mississippi. Reed said, "I knew when I first got on the road to get into Scuba and I saw sand and a rock and I saw a man on a horse. I thought, where in the world am I going?" But it was from Scuba to Tuscaloosa, arguably a more ridiculous name, that Jarran Reed finds himself on Alabama and then a second-round pick of the Seahawks. Brent, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
What is this? I find it interesting. When you're looking for guys who aren't highly touted out of high school or out of college, and then become these, better players or great players. How often it is a size thing, and then it's the size, whether they change size or whether their size they were just being played in the wrong position. How often it is a thing where these guys can excel not because they're like the prototypical defensive lineman or linebacker or cornerback or quarterback or whatever, but it's because they're atypical. Is Jarran Reed an atypical defensive lineman in your mind?
I don't think he is now. He's actually very, very prototypical. Just exactly what you'd think of when you're thinking, hey, massive tree stump looking guy, just girth, terrifying, and he plugs up everything in the middle. So now, no, he's definitely not atypical. He's exactly what the prototype is.
But maybe those atypical in the sense of in the way that they got here, in the sense of because he, if he was, say, a 300-pounder as a sophomore in high school, maybe he doesn't gain the athleticism or the footwork or some of the nimbleness that guys who've been huge their entire lives have been, right?
Oh, absolutely. He had to learn, going through high school, he's I think a 260-pound linebacker, a little bit too big to play it and be fast enough to do that, but definitely not big enough to be a defensive lineman either. Then he hits his growth spurt after he goes off to community college. And like he said, kind of alludes to in that, it was a learning experience and a big mental challenge. And we kind of know the whole Seahawks culture with just kind of your mental challenges, overcoming adversity, grit, especially if you've listened to any of Michael Gervais' podcasts lately. You have to wonder if Jarran Reed's kind of working on getting into that mindset and has learned a lot from the early hardships.
And Rob, as far as what you saw about Reed coming out of college and doing more scouting on him, this is a guy that had, once he's drafted, we get more and more people saying, oh, I had this guy the top 15 or top 10 player. This is my number 1 or number 2 rated defensive tackle on the board. You're a guy that scouts so many players, but what would you want to know about Brent's perspective, having watched him so closely at Alabama?
Well, I guess I'd just like to know, whether or not he has the capacity to become even more than he was at Alabama, because really what we saw from him was fantastic run defense. But he played as a lot of the Alabama defensive linemen do, a very small percentage of snaps compared to, I guess, what your average first or second round NFL pick is going to be expected to do at the next level. I mean, he was swapped in and out. He wasn't asked to do a great deal on third down. They could keep their best pass rushers very, very fresh. I mean, there's guys that are going to be big for Alabama next year that played something like 15% of the snaps last year and still had an impact. Is Jarran Reed somebody who, in maybe a more expansive role as a pro, could have even more of an impact than perhaps he had at Alabama, whether it's as a pass rusher or just in the case of playing more downs?
That'd be really interesting to see. Like you said, Alabama rotated, around normally about 9 different linemen throughout the course of a game regularly. So not even, your reserves to your starters. It was 9 guys that were pretty much starters. So we really didn't see Reed ever do much pass rushing. But if you look kind of at his traits, how he does things, he's explosive and powerful kind of early on. And most of the time, he's a 2-gap lineman. He's going to be waiting for a quarterback to run or your running back to choose a side, and then he reacts. Your few instances, I'm sure you've seen the play where he chases Clemson's quarterback, Deshaun Watson, all the way to the sideline. He can move fairly well for that size. And he's definitely got the reactions and, I guess, active hands to maybe learn to be a pass rusher. But again, we've never really seen him do it, so it's hard to say if he actually can or not.
And I'm going to get probably, I already, as you guys say the name and the way that I realized I said his name, I already know I'm going to get a comment. So Jarran Reed, I think I'd say Jarran. It's just a common thing for me to do. But Jarran Reed, as far as, you got this clip here of him stopping Nick Chubb, the Georgia running back who's arguably the best running back in a country loaded with running backs right now, and he just stops him. And, playing that against the offensive line and playing against the best running back and just being able to just stop him with an arm, the Seahawks are going to have to go up against Todd Gurley perhaps for the next 8 years or something like that. And they've already had, a pretty significant run defense, one of the best in the NFL. Just in terms of the times that Jarran Reed is on the field, how much more confident should Seahawks fans be and feel going up against the Todd Gurleys or the best running backs in the NFL?
Oh, absolutely. If a run's coming up the middle, he's got it. Alabama's always, since Nick Saban's been there, had one of the best run defenses. Pass defense can be kind of spotty at times, but this year was possibly the best one. And obviously there's a lot of defensive linemen that contributed to that, but Reed's the best. Like, he was the best run stopper. That's what he does. And, if a running back's coming to either of his 2 gaps, he's got it. Double team wise, he can also take those on. Not quite as good as he is at, your 2-gapping idea, but taking on double teams and allowing your other linemen and linebackers to get in there, make stops. He's got the strength and the lower body, just kind of girth and balance to hold that in too.
I thought it was such an interesting class out of Alabama this year. Only one player, their speculation, 4 or 5 guys from Alabama could have gone in the first round. Only one does. Ryan Kelly, the center, goes to the Colts at 18. But then 5 do go in the second round. Kenyon Drain goes in the third round, and that's the last Alabama player taken. So they were all really bunched up there, mostly from 41 to 60 and 73. Rob, what were your overall thoughts on this class at Alabama, and what are your thoughts, Rob, on next year's class at Alabama? And then I'll move on to Brett for his thoughts.
Well, there's obviously a new group coming through, as there always is at Alabama. You know, the one thing Nick Saban's done is he's managed to create this monster now where they constantly manage to recruit the best guys. You know, they get 5-star, 4-star recruits a lot, and they just sort of fill in the gaps when guys leave. They fill these in. You know, Jarran Reed was a JUCO prospect. You know, was very highly rated. They managed to lure those guys as well because they can plug them in straight away and they fill the gaps. So, you know, was it a great class? I think there were one or two that were overrated at Alabama. I certainly think that Ashawn Robinson was a little bit overrated as a prospect, and that's why he ended up going in round 2 as opposed to round 1, like a lot of people suggested. As for next year, I mean, you're going to get another batch of top talent. I mean, we have to wait and see what happens with Cam Robinson. He's been involved in some off-the-field issues this summer, but he's a left tackle prospect that could go very early if teams are happy with his background. We've got a whole host of pass rushers and defensive linemen. Jonathan Allen, you know, a lot of people expect big things from him. Tim Williams had a ridiculous number of sacks given how small a percentage of snaps he actually played for Alabama. I mean, he was on the field something like 15-20% at the time, and I think he had basically had a double-digit sack season. So he's going to be a real productive edge rusher for them, and because they can fill in the middle and they can get him in space, that he's just going to have another really good year for them. They have Eddie Jackson in the back end who could come in and have a big impact. You know, teams love the secondary guys coached by Nick Saban who come into the team. Perhaps a name that not many people talk about, Deshaun Hand, could come in and with players moving on that D-line, he could have a similar role to someone like DJ Petway. He's a much better athlete, but he could come in and have a big impact there. The other name that kind of intrigued me to see and would be interested to hear Brent's thoughts on Bo Scarborough, because you know, he's huge. He's been kind of dubbed the next big thing at Alabama. You know, he could be a like-for-like replacement for Derrick Henry. But I would be interested to hear what the thoughts are around Alabama as to how good he could be and whether or not he could, you know, fill in some of the gaps that Henry's going to leave. And the other guy that I would kind of highlight right now is a cornerback called Marlon Humphrey. He had 3 picks last year. I think his role is going to expand a little bit, and he could be somebody to keep an eye on.
Brent, you're going to have an opportunity, obviously, to respond to some of the next year guys as well. But, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about a lot of these players on 3000 NFL mock draft, so it'd be great to get your perspective. A lot of mock drafts had the Seahawks. They speculated, of course, for good reason. They would think that the Seahawks would take a center early. They waited to the 6th round, but Ryan Kelly's name came up a lot, and on this podcast, we didn't feel that Ryan Kelly was necessarily even the best center prospect in the draft. He goes 18th overall to the Colts. It seemed a little high for us. What kind of a center do you think the Colts are getting with Ryan Kelly? Because to be a first-round center, you really have to be one of the best in the NFL.
With Ryan Kelly, that was an interesting, almost meteoric rise right before the draft. Before that, he was normally projected, 3rd, 4th round most of the time. And then probably about a month beforehand, you see him start skyrocketing a little higher, a little higher, a little higher. And then by draft time, all of a sudden it's, hey, he goes 18th overall to the Colts. So he's a very, very intelligent player. He's been a starter for 3 years, I think. Maybe it might have been 4. Anyway, long-time starter. He rarely misses an assignment. But he's kind of an interesting body build for a center. So he's 6'5", just a shade over 300. And a lot of times he's struggled with your leverage on inside runs and power situations. Even though he's made rounds quite a few times, the best weightlifter on the team. Strong guy, but he struggles with his leverage a lot. Obviously, as a center, you don't really see how well he moves as often as you do with tackles or guards. But I definitely agree with you. I did not expect him to go that high. I didn't really watch a lot of the other centers in the draft, so I assumed maybe it was just a weak center class that kind of pushed him to the top just by default, and the Colts needed one. But at the very least, they're getting a technically solid assignment, almost perfect center they can plug in and play.
One of the most divisive, perhaps, prospects in the draft was Heisman winner Derrick Henry, and how good he could be. And are Alabama running backs overrated or Heisman running backs overrated? Should any running back be going in the first round? And ultimately, I think the Titans got a great pick from where they got him and the amount of picks that they had and the amount of needs that they had for the Titans to get Derrick Henry. Ultimately, where on your scale will Derrick Henry fall as far as being a number one lead running back?
Well, I'll start with a couple years ago when Henry was a high school prospect. I cover recruiting a lot for our website. So he was, about the same size, 6'3", 240, big guy, and broke almost every national high school rushing record there was. I think including Emmitt Smith's records out of Florida. So everyone wanted him to go play linebacker in college. All your recruiting services listed him as a 4-star athlete. A lot of colleges wanted him at linebacker. I wanted him at linebacker. He just looked like a guy that just ran in a straight line, and everyone just kind of bounced off of him. And I thought, hey, he can't do that in college. Well, he did. Kept doing the exact same thing. He just goes, and guys that try to tackle him either somehow miss or just kind of slide off of him because he has really long arms and stiff arms them. And he's fast. He's got breakaway speed and those long, really long stride. Nobody ever catches him from behind. At the same time, tackle for losses are a problem. He can't dodge players in the backfield very well. So a lot of his best plays, you'd never really think about that, but they're your stretches and toss sweep type of plays where he has time to build his speed going sideways and then just turn a corner and keep going rather than, dodging a guy in the backfield, cutting through a hole, those kinds of things. So were I watching him from another team, I would have said no, I wouldn't draft him till third, maybe fourth round, probably not start him, maybe think about a position switch. But he's already proved me wrong once, so I'm going to have to go with him again and see how he does. He has a way of getting the yards, and it doesn't make sense how he does it. He shouldn't be able to, and he just keeps doing it.
I mean, you could say the same thing about Russell Wilson, just a different player. I mean, there's really, any example of Wilson is going to be 1 in a million, but it is very similar about people wanting to play different positions or that he can't make it happen the next level. But if you keep producing everywhere you go, maybe that's just the way it's going to be. And definitely a good situation for him to play with behind another running back like DeMarco Murray and next to a quarterback like Marcus Mariota where the pressure is not going to be on him. But then, a significant one to the Seahawks, again, was A'Shawn Robinson and the fact that a lot of people projected A'Shawn Robinson to the Seahawks at the end of the first round. They ended up picking a defensive tackle out of Alabama, the one we've spoken about, just 3 picks later. But, Rob had a explosiveness metric that he devised this year, and Robinson was one of the absolute worst in terms of his combine numbers, and that it was just like perhaps the least explosive or one of the least explosive defensive linemen in the draft this year. What were your thoughts on Robinson?
I think that's pretty fair. I wasn't surprised at all to see him drop. I thought he was going to. I did not think Jarran Reed would, but I was pretty certain A'Shawn was going to. His freshman year, he came in a 5-star recruit out of Texas as an offensive lineman and kind of changed positions, went to the defensive line, and he actually played a 5 technique end for most of his freshman year. And I think he either led the team or was second on the team in sacks just as kind of a reserve lineman. He had almost a slippery way of he'd kind of hit a blocker and then move to the side and then take a straight line at the quarterback. And, from that freshman season, he got a whole lot of media hype, a lot of press, and he never really, after becoming a full-time starter, he never really lived up to that, even though the press stayed with him the whole time. Even as a run stopper, which, 320 pounds, he's a big dude, stout guy, a lot of times you'd see him get out leveraged, kind of pushed back, and he just couldn't really hold his own. Then at the same time, he would make, your occasional standout play and just flash a lot of potential that we'd see his freshman year. But he never really did it consistently.
Rob, I got to give credit to Brent, not just sounding like a very reasonable Alabama fan, but just a college student fan. Brent, you seem very grounded with your opinions, and not just loving every single player that comes out of Alabama, which I'm sure is tough to do when you guys are so successful. Rob, any thoughts there on some of the things that Brent had to say about those players out of Alabama?
No, it all sounds very fair. The thing with Alabama is that over the years they've had some really big name players come into the draft, and they've had a lot of big name stars that have not lived up to the billing. There has been some complaints over the years about the way that Nick Saban coaches the team. Does he get too much out of them at college? Does he work them too hard so that when they come to the NFL, they get little injuries or they're sort of worn out? He spoke to Brock and Salk actually on ESPN 710 recently, and I thought he had a very good answer when that question was put to him by Mike Salk, where he basically said that they have the best sports science in college football, and that if you actually look at it, they have the least number of injuries during a player's career in college, and that most of their players that go on to the next level don't get injured regularly. So it kind of nipped that one in the bud, and it's just a great program. If there is one thing, it's kind of a surprise that some of the players who you expect to do particularly well haven't done it. The Trent Richardsons, for example. One or two others that you just watch them playing for Alabama and you think these guys are going to be legitimate stars. I mean, there was absolutely nothing wrong with Cleveland taking Trent Richardson in the top 5 when they did. He was a terrific player in college and looked destined to be fantastic. He's probably just a notch down from the impression we have of Leonard Fournette right now at LSU, who's probably going to go in the top 5 next year. And yet it just hasn't worked for him. So, hopefully this current crop of players can come in and have a big impact. I think we've got great hopes for Jarran Reed. I'll be really interested to see what Derek Henry does with Marcus Mariota and DeMarco Murray in a Tennessee team that's suddenly starting to take a bit of shape. And there's one or two others, Cyrus Jones, people like that who, you have got a chance to have a good career here. But, the next crop that's coming through for Alabama, they're going to be contending again next year. It's going to be a draft where you probably have 2 or 3 guys who could go in the first round for Alabama again, candidates that are going to go that early. And, it's going to be another very interesting team to follow this year.
Brent, Rob raised, an interesting point about Alabama's recent draft picks, and it is brought up a lot just because there are so many that go in the first 2-3 rounds. And Nick Saban's players, whether or not there's anything to go on with Nick Saban's players or whatever, if that's what you want to call them, if your first year at Alabama was 4 years ago, that meant that the players that have been drafted since then in the first round would include D. Milliner, who has been unsuccessful with the New York Jets, Chance Warmack, who has not been very notable with the Titans, DJ Fluker, who's had an unsuccessful career with the San Diego Chargers in many respects, Eddie Lacy, who's had a very up and down career with the Green Bay Packers. In 2014, C.J. Mosley, the linebacker, he is now a Pro Bowler, HaHa Clinton-Dix, Cyrus Kawangio, who fell for health reasons, Amari Cooper, who had just a very good rookie season, Landon Collins and T.J. Yeldon going in the second round last year. Do you feel satisfied with the NFL production of some of the guys that I just named, and is there anything to be said about the way that Nick Saban's program or whatever breeds NFL players, or if they're just highly successful college players?
I think the biggest kind of systemic issue that stems from a lot of that kind of leads to that stigma of the Alabama players aren't making it in the NFL. First of all, when you look at just how many they're putting in, of course there's going to be a lot of busts, but for every bust there's also Julio Jones. But I think the biggest issue is not that he's, Saban's working them too much or they play too much, because, again, Alabama rotates players more than most teams because there's so many of them. But your biggest issue is going to be that Saban runs a very Bill Belichick type of program. The players' lives are completely structured down to they have people dedicated, like their job is to follow these players to class, make sure they go to class, make sure they do their homework, handle most of their finances for them, handle their meals for them, and make sure these athletes don't do anything stupid. Well, they get to the NFL where they don't have that level of, just authoritarian control over their lives, and I think a lot of them struggle with that after spending, for the most developmental years in that kind of situation. And a lot of players do handle it well and take what they learn to the next level and are awesome, but others don't really take that change as well. So regarding the guys in the NFL right now, the biggest disappointment obviously has been Trent Richardson. He was one of the best looking backs I'd ever watched in college. He was one of those, every time he'd run, you just see 3 or 4 defenders trying to drag him down, and he never did. He was more elusive than anyone thought he was. And, just one of those all-around backs that I thought was going to be amazing. And for whatever reason, he just imploded. D. Milliner was another. He always looked good, but he also didn't have a whole lot of starting experience. He was kind of a one-year wonder. So he was he was fast, 6'1", tall, prototypical-looking corner, good in man coverage. But again, not a whole lot of experience to base that off of. DJ Fluker, I never thought he should have went first round, or second, really. He was a sack machine at Alabama, gave up all kinds of sacks, just always out of position. He was solely drafted on his high school recruiting rankings, and that's all I got there.
Another one that is relevant, we talked about Trent Richardson. 4 picks after Trent Richardson was Mark Barron, who went to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That didn't work out. The Rams picked him up for almost nothing, and then all of a sudden he becomes a successful player for the Rams, but in a way that is less easier to decipher or see on paper, perhaps, than most, say, safeties or defensive players, because he's playing sort of these new positions of these hybrid-ish safety linebackers, and it's not going to jump out on the page, but they signed him to a big contract extension. What are your opinions and thoughts on Mark Barron right now, since the Seahawks will be facing the Rams defense once again twice this year, and it's given them gigantic problems in the recent past?
Mark Barron was one of those guys. He was Nick Saban's first recruiting class. That, almost legendary 2008 class. Mark Barron, Julio Jones, Dante Hightower. A lot of these guys were kind of the very first leg of this, resurrected Alabama program. And Barron he spent his first couple of years, would try to break into the starting rotation, and then would make a whole bunch of mental on-field mistakes, and Saban would kind of bench him again. And this went on for a couple of years before he finally figured it out and got in there full-time starter, and he had a great junior year. But again, he's a linebacker playing in a safety's body. So when Tampa Bay drafted him, wanted him in the cover 2, Tampa 2 type of defense, it just didn't work out well. He doesn't have the speed or range or even mental ball hawking ability to do that. He moves into St. Louis, or I guess they're Los Angeles now, but who gives him the more of a better role of, hey, there's a ball carrier on your side, go take him down. And that's what he does. He's outstanding tackler, aggressive blitzer, and he's got one of those players with a lot of energy when he plays and enjoys hitting. So in the Rams defense, I think he's going to fit very well, unfortunately. So I think it was a good signing for him.
Rob, same sort of question in terms of Mark Barron and what you thought of him coming out of Alabama in 2012 and how you see him fitting with the Rams in 2016.
Yeah, I mean, I thought he was pretty good coming out. I mean, a guy who probably should have gone in the top 12 based on athletic potential, what you saw on tape, had a good range. Bit of a surprise that it didn't work for him in Tampa Bay, but then it didn't work for Revis in Tampa Bay and one or two other big names that they've signed to play in that secondary over the years. So perhaps not a big shocker there. I think that the role that he's playing in at Los Angeles is probably the role that he would have played if he'd have ended up in Seattle. I mean, there was a bit of talk after that draft that the Seahawks really liked Luke Kuechly and Mark Barron, and that they were options if they fell to, I think the Seahawks picked 12th overall and they moved down to 15 before they selected Bruce Irvin. They were two players they really liked if they'd have been available. It was also my understanding that they were almost certainly always going to go for a pass rusher in that situation. That they wanted to sort of add that pass rush playmaker in that draft. So I don't think they ever really truly expected Barron or Kuechly to be there. So I mean, he's a decent player. What they're paying him now is incredible, which always changes the way that you view a player. Pulling off a steal of a trade and getting a guy and making it work in terms of the trade and then giving the team a thumbs up for the work they've done there and pulling that one off is great. But then when you start paying a guy a ridiculous sum of money, then you start sort of wondering what the situation's going to be like, moving forward. Is it still going to look quite as good a couple of years down the line? So they're not paying a quarterback anymore because Jared Goff's going to be fairly cheap for them throughout the next sort of 3 or 4 years. So they probably feel like they can be a little bit extravagant on things like that. They're going to end up paying, God knows what Aaron Donald's eventually going to get when he gets paid. That is going to come up, and that is going to be very interesting for them because I think the whole face of the NFL is going to change over the next 5 years. Because what you're going to have is defensive linemen are now going to expect to get the same kind of money as Fletcher Cox got. Fletcher Cox's guaranteed money is more than Cam Newton and Russell Wilson and Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers. So teams are now going to be forced into this situation where guys who have been pretty good on the defensive line are now going to expect quarterback money. And it's going to be very difficult to keep those players. The Seahawks have lucked out big time getting Michael Bennett to the contract and Cliff Abel to the contract that they did at the time, because they've got the security of having those two guys now, paying them a ridiculous sum of money compared to what the Giants spent over the offseason, for example, or what Philadelphia's just spent. And they spent the money on Vinny Curry as well. So, they're spending a lot of money there. And for all the great talent the Rams have on their defensive line, they're now going to have to pay those guys. So it's going to be very difficult. I think the way forward for teams is going to be ultimately to try and find impact defensive linemen in the draft and be fully prepared to lose those players after 4 or 5 years, because the NFL is going to get to a point where they just cannot afford to pay so many defensive linemen the kind of money that they're currently paying unless the cap goes up astronomically. You can't pay a quarterback and a star defensive lineman anymore. So the face of the NFL is going to change dramatically, I think, over the next 2 or 3 years, and teams are going to find it pretty difficult.
Yeah, you bring up the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Darrelle Revis, and one of the most interesting teams is the 2013 Tampa Bay Buccaneers was 23 on that defense. Mark Barron was 24. Deshaun Goldson was on that defense. Darrelle Revis was on that defense. They had just taken Jonathan Banks in the second round. Gerald McCoy was 25 years old, and he was on that defense. On offense, they were going into that season with Josh Freeman. He was 25, coming off a 27-touchdown season. Doug Martin was 24. Vincent Jackson was just coming off another huge season. Mike Williams was coming off of a 996-yard and 9-touchdown season. And the 2013 Tampa Bay Buccaneers went 4-12. Just a fascinating sort of team, especially to look back on in retrospect and see, for some of the teams going into 2016, whether it's the Rams or someone else, to have high hopes. You got to prove the model works before you get too excited about, the additions or the players going in or how long they'll be lasting and all that kind of stuff. Just a very interesting team to me, the 2013 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We're wrapping up 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Brent, I'm thankful for you coming on the show. I want to ask, because I'm always fascinated to look ahead to the future, even if it's 2 or 3 years down the line. But you mentioned that you pay heavy attention to high school recruiting and those classes coming in Alabama. They're going to get the best recruits in the nation, or at least they're going to have their name in the hat of every great recruit. As far as the incoming class of freshmen for Alabama or guys coming up right now, who are some of the names that we should be looking out for in 2016, 2017, 2018?
Okay, you mentioned earlier, I think Rob did, Bo Scarborough. Um, he's almost become a legend before playing. He had, what, 18 carries last season? Um, he was a guy that did not qualify academically his first year, and instead of going to a JUCO or anything like that, he finished up his courses through his high school. I'm not sure how that worked. Sat out a year and then joined as a freshman a year later. He's 6'2", 240, and played both running back, defensive line, and slot receiver in high school. Kind of an odd combination. But anyway, after his freshman year, he tore an ACL. Or I think it was before that. Missed the whole season, and then finally came in last season with a knee brace, kind of as the fourth running back in the pecking order. Well, in the few carries he got, just Google it on YouTube, something like that. You'll see him truck a couple of Michigan State defenders, knock some guy flat on his back. It's terrifying, to say the least. So, around Alabama, he's become a legend already. He's the next Derrick Henry, but he's a completely different style of player. While Henry was a speed back in a big guy's body, almost, Scarborough is not. He is a pure battering ram that can catch. But we've seen him for 18 carries and a torn ACL. So nobody really knows what's going to happen. And even though he's a true sophomore this year, he's been out of high school for 3 years. So technically he will be draft eligible if, for whatever reason, he just breaks out and has an amazing season. So past that, a couple of guys for this upcoming draft, I'd say your biggest one to watch for is a redshirt senior, Ryan Anderson. Doesn't get a whole lot of headlines behind your Tim Williams and Jonathan Allens, but I think he's probably the most technically sound of all of them. He's a outside linebacker, defensive end hybrid guy, been around forever, just kind of rotating in and out. And he's actually the starter at Jack linebacker, which is kind of like the Leo for the Seahawks, but in a 3-4 alignment. He's actually the starter over Tim Williams. Bigger guy, not as fast, but technically is almost perfect. He's got a huge array of different pass rushing moves, and it's a lot of fun to watch if you ever focus on just him. Marlon Humphrey is another one you mentioned earlier. Got his first start this year after redshirting his freshman year. He's a Bama legacy. His dad was a great running back 30 years ago or so. And he's a great track athlete, 6'1". He reminds you a lot of D. Milliner a few years ago. The medium prototypical height, very fast, extremely fluid athlete. That he had his share of mental mistakes this year, but again, it was his redshirt freshman year, first time starting, so he'll be one to keep an eye on. He'll be a redshirt sophomore. If everything goes right, he's got the athletic potential. He could be an early declare and go pretty high in the draft. If you're looking forward, interesting guy coming in, it'll be 3 years before he's draft eligible, but his name's Nigel Knott. Skinny, I think 170, 6'1" corner. But using your high school spark ratings, he blew everything out of the water. I mean, 46-inch vertical jump, under a 4.440 time, under 4 seconds on a shuttle. It was absolutely insane. So that'd be one to watch 3 years from now.
All right, we will look out for this year, next year, 3 years from now, all the years. Thank you, Brent Taylor. Where can people find you on Twitter?
At BTBama22. So initials Alabama 22.
There you go.
It's pretty easy.
At BTBama22. And the name of Alabama's blog?
Roll Bama Roll. They've also got a Twitter. Our manager's pretty funny and tweets a lot. So if you want an entertaining follow, you can follow that one.
And Alabama always relevant, whether you like it or not, during the college football season and the draft season. Thank you, Brent. You can look out for him as well as on, I'm sure, upcoming, Seahawks field goals articles. So look out for that. Rob Staten at Rob Staten. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com for more Seahawks draft news and such and the like, and draft news in general and Seahawks news in general. And, of course, FieldGoals.com. And follow on Twitter at Field Goals. And thank you for tuning in to another episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Until next week, we'll see you on the next draft.